Howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, presenting to you once again from the Bullshit Corner 2.0, and today I'd like to talk to y'all about textures. So, as y'all saw from that brief little clip of opening up the package, Edna and her cats are a multi-part metal model kit. They all have a little metal tab on the bit and some flashing that's going to need to be cleaned up. So, we're going to go ahead and get those cleaned up, glue her to some pegs, and airbrush on a primer. Alrighty y'all, let's start out this project by preparing these models for painting. First things first, we need to get rid of all this extra pewter. It's time to bring out the trusty hobby clippers and snip away those casting gates and sprues. Whew, that's better. Next up, we gotta get rid of those pesky mold lines and that excess flashing. Let's grab our hobby knife and carefully scrape away those imperfections. Of course, it's always good to cut directly towards yourself while working on these bits. Remember, safety first, folks. I'm just kidding. Please make sure to cut away from yourself when you're slicing bits or scraping mold lines. A sharp hobby knife can easily make a serious wound, so be super careful and don't injure yourself. Next up, we'll go ahead and snip the tips off of some toothpicks for the next step. But first, I need to introduce today's guest palette, Rattata. Once again, I feel obliged to mention this whole guest palette thing. The first time this was done was out of necessity, and the next few were really just a bit. But now I do highly recommend working from a puddle of glue rather than trying to squeeze it out onto the surfaces you're working with. Using a tool to apply a small bit gives such precision and control that it's well worth sacrificing a few scraps of paper or stickers or bottle caps. Digressing, we'll go ahead and mount these here little kitties onto the clipped toothpicks. Not only will it make handling the small cuties so much easier, but we could jab the sharp bit into a cork sheet to facilitate drying in the later steps. By the way, do y'all know what to call a toothpick that's afraid to fight? No? Well, it's a chicken stick. All joking aside, we're going to utilize them toothpicks to hold the models and spray them down with some Stynylrez Gray Primer. The mid-tone primer is going to work great for both the bright colors and the dark tones today, so it was the obvious choice. I recommend picking up a trio of these primers if you want to use them. That way you've got the white, black, and the gray ready to tackle any project. They all work just fine, but if you match the brightness of whatever base color you're working with, your painting project will usually go super smoothly. Bright tones demand a white prime, and dark colors insist on a black prime. That said, if you can't decide, you've always got the gray right in the middle. And now that we've got those models all prepped up, it's time to go ahead and start painting them up to their finished condition. Now normally here on the channel we follow these models from start to finish and show you the process, but today we're going to do something a little different. Today we're going to talk about 5 really easy textures that you can implement on your models to make them stand out on the tabletop. Alrighty, we're on to the meat and taters of this here video today, jumping into our first texture that is all too common on models in almost any setting, and that texture is stone. No matter what base tone you're working with, the process is largely the same. In our case today, there's going to be 3 colors of stone, all painted in Vallejo colors. We've got bricks in Hull Red, we've got large pavers in medium sea gray, and we've got small cobblestone in flat earth. All of these stones will get a nice solid base coat before moving on to the next step. We'll just apply 2 thin coats in that typical fashion, ensuring that the entirety of the surface has nice, even, opaque coverage. From here, we're going to use the same highlight colors for all of these base tones. That's going to be ivory and dark sand, sticking with that there Vallejo family of paint. Using these here highlight tones, we're going to introduce a bit of variation to the individual stones, adding varying amounts of the lightening color to bring a bit of visual interest, all by feel and not really through a formulaic approach. Just mix in a bit here and there, and if it looks good, it's good enough. It's good to apply at least 2 extra colors here beyond the base coat so as to have some variety that ends up looking somewhat realistic while also providing multiple shades for your eyes to drink up. Continuing that idea of visual interest, we'll also mix some of the individual base tones together. This way we unify the different stone types to have the same feel despite being different colors. We can further unite these 2 past approaches and add in a bit of the highlight tone to make a wholly new color variety. And you know what they say, variety is the spice of life, and we want to make sure this sidewalk is seasoned to perfection. Next up, we'll dry brush a mix of the ivory and the dark sand over all of these stones, further unifying their colors into a cohesive set. There's no proper assigned ratio for these colors, just pick a blend that looks good to you and put it over all of the stones, making sure to dry brush everything with the same color. This use of a singular color does the best job of tying everything together. Just remember to go real light in your application of this dry brush layer. It's real easy to go overboard, so sticking to the lightest coat you can manage is definitely the way. You can always add more, but you can't really take it away once it's done. Kinda like all those regretful moments of the past. Finally, it's all going to get coated with a strongly liberal application of Citadel's Agrax Earthshade. This brown wash will tamp down any super bright color and grime up the crevices really well. In the exact opposite fashion of the last step, we want to apply this wash extremely thick as we absolutely can take away the excess. And that's just what we're going to do. We'll use a paper towel to mop up the majority of this here heavy wash and leave a slight surface stain as well as a stronger brown deep in the cracks. And with that, these stone faces look properly stony without much work at all. The next texture on our agenda today is going to be one that's fairly ubiquitous again in any setting. I'm talking about cloth textures, of course. Whether you're painting up Granny's sweater or a heroic cloak on a power armor clad warrior from the 41st millennium, cloth textures can show up in both surprising and expected places, and a little bit of applied technique can really make those bits communicate that texture at arm's length. So, that waffling on the topic out of the way, we're going to start this bit with some simple base coats. In the typical fashion, this is going to be done with a nice mid-tone color applied in 2 thin coats. Here, those colors are Citadel's Gene Stealer Purple and Warbroth's Green. Both of these colors really benefit from a couple of translucent coats as opposed to thick application to avoid a buildup of unintentional texture. But with that said, we're not here to talk about the standards of painting techniques, but rather how to create an intentional texture effect. Once we have those base coats applied, we'll do some quick shading of the base colors using contrast paints. The purple will be contrastified using this here Magos Purple, while the green is going to receive its shade work with Warp Lightning. These shade layers will do a lot of the heavy lifting for us, especially in that these particular bits of cloth have rich details in the sculpted folds of the fabric. As is standard, we'll apply a thick layer of this here washing step and let it flow into the recesses, creating some deep contrast on the topography of the model. Of course, it's really important to mind the pooling so as to not overdo it, and then also allow this layer to fully dry before moving forward. And now that we've got the rich contrast applied using, well, contrast paints, we'll go ahead and start with the layer that'll make these surfaces read as cloth. Instead of the normal way of layering based on solely the shapes of the model's surface, we're going to apply each of the highlight layers using a sketchy series of horizontal marks. We're still going to apply the highlights to the areas where they would normally be present, but the idea here is to build up that lighter tone using a repetitive and regular marking, suggestive of textiles. This doesn't necessarily have to be a horizontal stroke, but in this case I felt that this pattern would read the best considering the long lines of the vertical folds in Edna's dress. The direction of the pattern isn't quite as important as maintaining the regularity of that direction, as this pattern is what's really going to sell that cloth look on your model. Our next texture is hair, and it's likely going to be the most simple one to achieve. This technique is going to be effective in painting up fur on creatures, or hair on the heads and beards of characters, or even the borders of fancy furniture dressings, anywhere there might be really puffy, fluffy areas of dense sculpted surface texture. As with most areas of detail on your model, we're going to need to start out by putting down a base coat. Whenever I'm working on base coats, I like to use a solid fat-bottomed brush with a nice sharp tip, as they hold a whole bunch of paint. This here number 3 round is a great example of that and works really well when the paint is thinned down properly. It almost seems to never run out of paint. This will let you coat an entire area of the model, and this application is no exception. In this case, Edna's fuzzy mop top calls out for an all-over coloration using some thinned down ivory as that starting point. Naturally, we'll use 2 thin coats for full coverage. From here, I decided that I wanted to play with that whole trope of a blue-haired old lady. So to give her messy curls that stereotypical blue rinse, a mixture of Army Painter speed paints will be used. A 75-25 mix of Gravelord Gray and Highlord Blue respectively will mix up that proper shade color, and we'll go ahead and apply a liberal coating of this here stain over all of that white hair, taking great care to not get any on her skin, as that would be quite difficult to fix up at this point. Once applied, we'll need to let this fully dry, and I mean absolutely fully dried and cured, since we're going to go to that most magical of techniques next and dry brush this hairdo. We'll start out with an all-over light dry brush of ivory, where this off-white tone will do some work to warm up that hair, pulling it back from that cold blue shade. Less is more here, and it's best to use really light coats built up over time rather than overdoing it all in one go. Just make sure to have a little patience and a super gentle touch, and you'll build up the effect that you're after in no time at all. Even though we want to use multiple layers here, this is dry brushing we're talking about, and the layers are more or less dry the moment they get applied, ready to take up more paint nearly right away. Next up, we want to bring her hair into truly white territory, so it's time to bust out the Citadel White Scar layer paint. Just like the last step, we're going to gingerly apply this color in super light layers until the desired effect is achieved. This technique is great for any color of hair or fur, just substitute the colors out for some that make more sense for your individual application. Riding this train down the texture track, next we're going to work on wood textures. This one's a little finicky, as we need to paint on some illusory markings that don't necessarily go like typical layered highlights. Much as was the fashion with our cloth texture today, we'll add in some calculated brush strokes to suggest this texture, even if the model's surface topography doesn't necessarily reflect the texture we're trying to bring out. So, as per all bits of the model, we'll start out with a nice solid opaque base coat layer using some thinned down paints. Just like Mr. Duncan Rhodes insists upon, and of course I'll always defer to his expertise, 2 thin coats will get the job done without clotting up the details on your model. For this particular portion of the project, we'll be sticking to the Vallejo family of paints. Our base coat today is going to be done with my most favorite color, Flat Earth. Our model today features wood on one of the bases as well as on Edna's cane. Not too much of this texture, but enough to warrant a bit of effort. We'll carefully get a full opacity coat on the planks and then on that old walking stick, making sure to not get any of this dark brown tone onto the surrounding detail. Now that we've got the base coat solidly applied, it's time to add the first layer of highlighting. For this, we're going to use Game Color's Heavy Brown to start creating that woody feel. Painting wood is less about the color. In fact, wood can easily be tones of gray instead of brown, but it's more about tricking the eye into perceiving that quintessential grain patterning. These planks, for instance, are a simple matter, and we don't need to force that grain as they have the texture already sculpted into the model's surface. Edna's cane, on the other hand, is all smooth surface with the exception of that little bit of pewter that I missed during the cleanup stage. To correct that, we'll just snip it off and then apply another layer of the base coat to cover up the metallic scar. No worries, just quick and it's done. Digressing, we're going to go through a similar process as before in highlighting up this next section of wood texture. Unlike the planks though, we need to use a brush with a sharp point and sketch on vertical lines to suggest the wood grain. Moving forward, we need to add a proper highlight over the last layer of this here texturing, and that's going to call for a warm off-white to bring up the color. We'll get out our dark sand once again and mix a bit of that into the last color in about a 50-50 ratio. And once we have that tone, just like with any application of edge highlighting, we'll go back and put this color onto the raised or uppermost facing portions of the highlights, creating a bit more depth for our viewers' eyes to drink up. Applying this highlight to the planks is super easy and straightforward, but it's going to be a bit more interpretive on the cane. Again, we're going to focus on the uppermost portions of this highlighting layer and also ensure that this new color remains inside the confines of the last tone. With a bit of patience and precision, we'll create the intended wood grain effect despite the model surface being completely smooth. For our final texture of the day, we're going to be working with metal. This here is a simple texture to achieve, and it's mostly going to be focused on the use of a few particular products. But these exact commodities are not necessary. Instead, it's more of a framework of an idea to achieve that metallic look. Just like with every other portion of this model, we're going to start out with a base coat over top of our primer. In this case, we need a dark color to work from, and don't nothing work better for that blackout effect than Vallejo's black. We'll apply 2 thinned coats to achieve full opacity, and then we can move on to the next layers wherein we'll play with true metallic colors. Before we get there, however, it's really important to have solid coverage of this black on everything that's going to be metal, because the shadows produced by this base coat will create a deep contrast for your underpainting as well as hide any areas of low coverage, which can often be a problem when applying metal colors. Of course, solid coverage isn't a problem for this here particular paint. Today I'm going to be using Vallejo Metal Color Jet Exhaust. This line of paints applies really smooth and with rich pigmentation in very few layers. Whether you're using it through the airbrush or applied by hand, it has yet to disappoint. It's a bit pricier than your typical bottle of Vallejo, but you get a gigantic bottle of it for your money, and I can't recommend enough picking up a few tones from this line of paint to add to your collection, as well as toss your friendly local gaming store some business. Moving on, next we need to add some weathering and shade to that metallic coat, and ain't nothing better for achieving this look than Citadel's Gnome Oil Shade. This stuff adds just the right mix of brown and black and gives a grimy, well-worn look that imparts some realism and a heavy feel to your metallic paints. I dare say that this wash is more important than the choice of metallic color, and I suggest picking up this particular product. Friends of the channel would know that I'm not a huge fan of Games Workshop, but this stuff here is in a category all its own and is well deserving of a spot in your paint collection. This final step is absolutely optional, but I also recommend picking up a bottle of this here dirty down water soluble rust effect. We're going to add a couple layers of this here product onto our metal surfaces and blend it with a bit of water to get some really nice crusty rusty spots. $20 or so will add this bottle to your collection, and it's well worth that investment. These last 2 products both deserve a Country Fried Minis seal of approval. And now that we've gone through all these 5 textures and finished up all the painting portion of these models, it's time to go ahead and put them on their bases and add those final touches that'll make them look completed and ready to show off. Now that our texture work is complete and the painting has been finished in the interim off camera, it's time to get back our guest palette for another round of holding on to our super goopy sticky adhesive. Thanks again, Rattata. Now that we've got another puddle of our fixative, we're going to snag one more toothpick and apply this mucilaginous glue to the bottoms of each of the models before picking out the proper base for each one and putting it in its proper place. We'll simply smear and select and rinse and repeat to get all of these fun minis onto these texture-laden bases. One quick tap of the Insta-Set Super Glue Accelerator and they are good to go. From here, we've just got to get out our Apple Barrel Bright Magenta and paint out all the little kitties' noses. Once that step is complete, just like with any finished model, we'll black out the base rim with 2 thin coats of Vallejo black and call them done. This was particularly challenging with the smallness of the kitties, but with some gentle handling and smooth brushwork, the rich pigment density of this Vallejo paint made short work of this step, wherein we were able to minimize the time spent handling the models. With this step behind us, it's time for a grand reveal. In the end, those textures added so much to these models. The base choices really went a long way in making them look well rounded and like fun little pieces to put on any tabletop. I figure I could use them as high value targets in Infinity, or maybe as some pieces in a tabletop RPG. Who knows? The opportunities are endless using these here Reaper models. And speaking of Reaper, I highly recommend that you go out and pick yourself up some of these here Reaper Chronoscope options. They have a lot of really fabulous sculpts. They're really fun to paint on, and you never know exactly what you're going to get, like Farah the sci-fi heroine or Natalia the female secret agent. I recommend checking out all they have available, or maybe even looking at your friendly local gaming store and seeing if they have any of these fun blisters on the shelf. Digressing, I want to thank y'all once again for joining me here in the Bullshit Corner here on Country Fried Minis. We always have a lot of fun over here, and the content may not be coming out as fast as I'd like, but we're still grinding away at it, and I've got some fun projects planned for the future. In conclusion, I hope that you found the techniques we've presented today to be super useful for your own painting progress. These here textures add so much to your models, and the effects are really easy to achieve. It don't take much work at all, and it definitely don't take any specialized products. That said, I do recommend the Dirty Down product line. They're a little bit expensive, like $20 a bottle or so, but it's well worth it to add it to your collection so you can get these really fun effects on your models. Here at the end, I want to thank y'all for joining me today, and I want you to remember, as always, stay happy while you're painting. Take it easy, fellas. See you around next time.